the phenomenon of structural racism. Because when I was growing up as a Caribbean person, what I learned was that the problem of the indigenous people in the United States was a racist problem. That the indigenous people, like the African diaspora, were victims of the structural racism, in that everything else was, derived of that. It had been like 10 years maybe that I was aware of the fact of land and sovereignty and legal crisis. So how these ideas and this movement that you're part of integrate or dialogue or ignore perfectly the other race issues in this context.
One quick thought on that, and I'm not sure if this will be quite getting to your question. But a quick thought about that. I mean, is the distinction between civil rights and struggles for equality and struggles for decolonization and indigenous rights in that sense. I think it's sometimes easy for the U.S. to sort of position them as the same thing, right? Position them as subject to the exact same sets of processes. But inclusion is not necessarily restoration of political autonomy, right? And so I think so often that's a half measure toward steps of recognizing that sort of autonomy that don't really amount to a full-fledged commitment in that sense.
Okay. I guess my initial thoughts, I would want to say that I think what I mentioned earlier about understanding indigeneity as a category of analysis and what it does to something like the immigration kind of battles going on right now, or migrant questions in the border. I mean, for me, I would start analytically just by parsing the difference between indigeneity and race, and also the distinctions between race and ethnicity, and understanding these as different analytics and social formations, and that you can have all these things operating even in one particular subject or peoplehood or case study. And so for me, it's about making those distinctions. And I think about just going back to Connecticut for a minute. I mean, thinking about the tribes that were denied federal recognition after the BIA gave them a preliminary positive, the Schaghticoke tribe, Schaghticoke Indian tribe, and the Eastern Pequots. And there's their two indigenous peoples. They're on their traditional reservations, one from the 1600s, Schaghticoke from the early 1700s. It's been continuously occupied since those centuries. And race worked to deny their indigeneity. So this is not just short circuit what you're talking about, this other racist issues, but I do want to talk about race in the way that it worked there. People talked about the Schaghticoke. I mean, this is Kent, Connecticut, where a lot of like rich Manhattanites have their 4th or 5th country homes, like the kind of quaint town. People very threatened there, including Kissinger, who lives there, around the prospect of a casino. And so people talked about them as a mongrel group, a motley crew, and there was this racist discourse around them being white trash. In many ways it was coded at some point, but there was this kind of notion that they're not authentic, but around their whiteness in a way. And for Eastern Pequot, it was so different. It was about, they're really black, they look black, they're coded as black, and so you have this anti-blackness that's at work. And the thing is, both tribes have African and European ancestry, right? But the way that the discourse was used to mobilize racism, to debunk their indigeneity, right? So looking at the way that anti-blackness works, or the way that class disparity around questions of whiteness and being entitled or deserving was working, and looking at class as a particularly different kind of axis of difference. And just thinking, like in the pedagogical sense, when I talk about these cases, it's like I always say, like, yeah, you can have all those other ethnicities, but that's not what the sovereignty is about. The sovereignty is about your lineage to Eastern Pequot, or your genealogy to Schaghticoke and to that territory. Historically, as an historic tribe that basically was relegated to these small reservations, right? Because the rest of it was taken, and now you want to take away this last part. But I mean, I think for me, some of the most incredible examples right now are around the solidarity between like movement for Black Lives and like No DAPL, right? Or around Palestine, decolonization and liberation of Palestine. And so really making the connections around Black Lives Matter, movement for Black Lives with indigenous sovereignty. And I think about that for the migrant questions in the border. I mean, thinking about the work of like No One Is Illegal up on the Canadian side of the border, where it's all this migrant justice work that deals with refugees and people who are totally embattled, but with a really active, not just a symbolic or just a word, like kind of lip service to indigenous sovereignty, but building relationships with the indigenous peoples whose land people are on, and saying, look, there are Syrian refugees or Somalian refugees that are about to be deported. These are like activist facilitators, like bringing people to those tribal lands and going to the tribal leaders and saying, like, can you meet with these people? And people are basically forging relationships, even though in that example the Canadian state is doing this kind of violence. But what does that everyday recognition look like that's not hinged upon the state? And so their slogan is, no one is illegal, Canada is illegal. And so thinking about that, and I mean, I think about that with Black Lives Matter and the importance of the Coalition of Movement for Black Lives, and linking that to indigenous sovereignty, and that these often get set up as competing frames instead of understanding that you know that those are intricately bound systems, and that's the genealogy of this country, right? Slavery and settler colonialism and the violences and the overlap of those projects.
Yeah, I think in my research, the first things that came up, one was an example of it kind of reaffirming and building into that structural racism, and the other is ways in which it kind of moves beyond or away from it, right? Which so the first is thinking about I'm from Oklahoma. I'm a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation, and those ideas of structural racism have been legally coded into my community at the point when the roles were being created to create allotment, the Dawes rolls. The Dawes rolls themselves from the Bureau of Indian, the U.S. government created two categories of Chickasaw people. One were Chickasaws and one were freedmen of the Chickasaw Nation. And so it created two different groups based on all sorts of faulty reasoning, that essentially rendered individuals that were the descendants of Chickasaw slaves or who had married in the group but looked more black than Chickasaw were put on rolls that said they were Chickasaw freedmen instead of Chickasaw. And that's a category that is still held up within my community and many others, right? So people who are on the Chickasaw rolls are citizens and people who are on the freedmen rolls are not. So that's a way in which it was a very complicated process. It was entirely, right, in the point when they were deciding who would go on which roll, people walked up to the table and they said, you, based on your appearance, you go on this one, you'll go on that one, or based on your last name, you go on this one, you go on that one, right? So not actually built on Chickasaw kinship processes, not actually built on any number of things, and of course the entire enrollment process of that era was around ideas of blood quantum and trying to quantify that, and so it was trying to create and it did create, right, legal systems based on perceptions of race and how it is maintained, where it comes from, where even indigeneity comes from in terms of blood. So that is something that is still very active and exists. It exists in various ways in different communities. And then the example that's on the other side of that is the work that's often done in language revitalization, in which you have alliances that are not just across indigenous communities in, say, the US or Canada, but actually a lot of global alliances where people are recognizing that regardless of whether it's Canada or Mexico, regardless of whether it's Australia or lots of places. I work with a community that's an indigenous language in Kenya, right, recognizing that the effects of colonialism are globally worldwide, and so there might be alliances that happen. And so a lot of that work actually is intentionally refusing some of the still existing colonial logics that say, obviously we would connect communities within the US and Canada, but not Mexico, right? Those groups wouldn't be classified as indigenous, or you wouldn't have activism that goes across those lines. So you have, there's lots of work on language revitalization and activism, even within urban spaces, that says, yes, we have a lot of indigenous languages that are coming from Mexico, Latin America. That is just as vital a project, and in fact, we're going to work together and see what kinds of teamwork can come out of it. So that's an intentional work, I think, refusing those kind of contemporary colonial borders and ideas of race, because the borders are connected to race, right, and the ways that assumptions that come with them. So I think it's an ongoing dynamic issue that, again, differs from community to community, moment to moment, and even topic to topic.
start. Okay.
Professor Kawanui, this is for you just because I had recently read your article, Tracing Historical Specificity, Race, and the Colonial Politics of Incapacity. But other professors, if you have ideas, please jump in as well. How does indigenous sovereignty engage with other critical theorists' engagement with abstraction isn't not like the best adjective, but it's kind of what I'm going with, like i.e. like Wilderson's kind of burn it all down, or like Calvin Warren's like destroying metaphysics, or maybe like queer theorists engagement with like jumping into a void of unintelligibility. Like how do those solutions contradict or agree with like indigenous decolonization or the Hawaiian concept of
I got part of the beginning, but I didn't get the link, the analytical link to the last part of your question.
How do those kind of solutions
What solutions, though? Are you talking about these other examples, these other theoretical modalities?
Yeah, that maybe like engage on like a metaphysical level or maybe a more abstract level. How do those contradict or agree with indigenous decolonization or sovereignty?
It'll take me a while to unpack your question just because I don't want to alienate the rest of the audience. You've cited several different things, but I'll just start by saying the article that you cited of mine. It's a very short piece in a recent issue of the American Quarterly, and it's my own critical engagement with a discussion I had with Frank Wilderson in person when he came to Wesleyan University around a lecture that he delivered, and it's a broader critique of Afro-pessimist theory. And so my ears picked up when you said solution, because I don't think Afro-pessimism purports to have a solution. It's, I think of that work is nihilistic in many ways, and not trying to offer a solution at all. And that's not even my critique of it. I just don't think that that's what it sets out to do. But in terms of that with indigenous decolonization and indigenous sovereignty, which I heard is the beginning of your work, I think for me, and I'll just stick with Frank Wilderson, you know, one of the books of his, one of his first works actually talks about, is a misunderstanding actually, it's an interesting discussion for sovereignty. Because if you look at Black, White, and Red, or Black, Red, and White, I always mix up the order, it's a book of, it's a study of film. And what Wilderson does, he's a film scholar, among other things at UC Irvine, is talk about indigenous sovereignty. He talks about tribes as post-colonial, for starters, but also talks about indigenous sovereignty as kind of a mini-me, a junior version of the master settler. And I think in that moment, there's a slippage around like the federal recognized native governing entity that is the .gov, like thinking of it in those terms as a subsidiary of federal government, which already is a problematic formulation, but I get it. But that's not the kind of indigenous sovereignty that most people are talking about when they say indigenous sovereignty, right? That's the federal recognized sovereign entity. And that's different. And that happens within all native nations, right? I mean, you can have the official Navajo government, but there's also all this other kind of governance going on that's traditional, right? Or you can think of what's going on at Chickasaw, or think about the FedRec people in Hawaii and the Hawaiian Kingdom Nationals, but that's not what the same thing as the Ea and the getting in the Lo'i, and that's an indigenous sovereignty. And you might have people involved in that are with these other camps, but to me that's not the kind of mini-me junior like master, like settler master like junior. And that's what he talks about, is like people that talk about indigenous sovereignty being co-opted and participating in and signing on to a master settler model. And part of the critique is, he says that, and he uses, in his lecture, he used Simon Ortiz's poetry, and then did a whole critique using his own poem to take down another poem. And I thought, well, if your poem is the authoritative knowledge to me, it was really interesting. But one of the things that really jumped out in that talk and in the book is that he says where indigenous peoples go wrong, and he doesn't cite actual indigenous studies scholars, and even indigenous scholars. He has Leslie Marmon Sicko, so he's citing a novelist. He cites a Native Hawaiian scholar activist to stand in for Native Americans. That's how 98 is. Ward Churchill, who's been challenged as a non-native for a long time, right? And then Simon Ortiz is a poet. And then he does cite Tayagi Alfred, but it's not, those aren't like representative, right? I think no offense to the novelists or fiction writers, but I don't think that's a stand-in for the field around Indigenous sovereignty. And I don't think Hawaiian should be kind of like in that space, because he's talking about American Indians specifically. But the core issue for me around that hinges on him saying that where American Indians or Native Americans go wrong is that they're insisting on their ontology is around Indigenous sovereignty instead of genocide. So for him, if they would just stick to the ontological relationship to genocide, then he could get with it. And it's just like, that's so not getting it, because this is about a futurity, right? And Afro-pessimism is not about a futurity, it's about the end of the world. And so to me, to kind of demand that, right, that it has to stay with the genocide project rather than Indigenous sovereignty, to misconstrue what that Indigenous sovereignty even is from the get-go. Not having the same conversation.
I don't want to cut off anyone's questions, but we're running extremely low on time, so those of you who still have questions, I invite you to talk to our speakers personally. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to